the Belt and Road in itself is Xi Jinping putting a name on what had been happening in Central Asia for some time already, and then taking that model and globalizing it. The relationship that China has with Central Asia is a very large and complicated one.
Hello and welcome to Chinese Whispers with me, Cindy Yu. Every episode, I'll be talking to journalists, experts, and long-time China watchers about the latest in Chinese politics, society, and more. There'll be a smattering of history to catch you up on the background knowledge, and some context as well. How do the Chinese see these issues? It's just gone a year since the chaotic US withdrawal from Afghanistan, but Russia has not replaced America in the region. Instead, there's a new great game on. Central Asia is now part of China's empire, or so says my guest on this episode of Chinese Whispers. He's Raffaello Pantucci, a senior associate fellow of the think tank Rusi, and author of Sinostan, China's Inadvertent Empire. The book looks at China's outsized influence in Central Asia among all the stands and is collated from a decade of travel in the region. There were two when they started, but Raffaello's co-author Alexandros Peterson was killed in a Taliban attack in Kabul 8 years ago. Raffaello has gone on to finish the book by himself. Raffaello, welcome to Chinese Whispers. Now, in the 20th century, Central Asia was seen as the USSR's backyard, but China has clearly usurped Russia's influence in the region now. And that's what I want to start by discussing. First, can you explain to listeners the geography of the region? Because I don't think I knew this until I saw a map in your book of where roughly the stands of Central Asia lie in relation to China.
So the countries that we're talking about, the 5 countries of Central Asia, which Kyrgyzstan, Kazakhstan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, Uzbekistan, are a little cluster of countries that essentially sit in between China and Russia and are bracketed by Mongolia sort of on one side, that they don't actually share a border with it, and the Caspian Sea on the other. And then to the other side, you've got a little corner which touches on Iran, and then, of course, Afghanistan underneath. But essentially, they sit in between these two countries. And for a very long time, they were always considered part of the Russian Empire in some way, shape, or form. And most recently, the Soviet Union. And so these are countries that are really only 30 years young, so they're only coming to sort of a relatively new state of development. And the border that they share with China was actually only one that was really defined in 1949. And I think the other critical thing, which is quite important and really ties China to this region in particular, is the fact that you've got communities within these countries. Each country is called like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, which, by the name suggests is the home of the Kazakh people or the Uzbek people. But in reality, there are Uzbeks and Kazakhs living in lots of the other countries as well. And so you've in fact got these sort of large, more nomadic tribes that essentially have had these borders written around them, which I think is quite important to think about because it does emphasize how kind of interlinked this region is. And in fact, how much China is in some ways as much a part of Central Asia, and in particular how much Xinjiang in some ways is a part of Central Asia as some of the 5 Central Asian countries. Just to give one example, there are roughly 1 million ethnic Kazakhs in China. Wow. And Kazakhstan has a population of only around 20 million people. So, you're talking about quite a substantial numbers that are sort of living outside each other's borders.
Wow, that's amazing. That nomadic point is really interesting because I think in Chinese history lessons, you kind of historically know that region as where the nomads come from, what in Europe we call the Huns. So it's fascinating to hear about the modern iterations of that. So when did modern China then, not the kind of imperial times I was just mentioning, when did modern China start to be interested in that region?
So it's, I'd argue there's 2 moments I think I would sort of point to. I mean, the first is clearly when, modern China was defined as we know it by the People's Liberation Army, and, we go back to 1949 and we sort of see the borders that were first drawn. But I think what we saw happen for the longest period of time during the kind of Soviet Union was a borderland that was essentially very remote and largely ignored to some degree and pretty fluid in some ways between China and what was then the Soviet Union. I think when you had the Soviet Union fall apart, is probably the moment that we can track the most recent kind of articulation of China's relations with these countries, because at that point they became countries. And one of the first acts that we saw from a Chinese perspective was the creation of something called the Shanghai Five Organization, which was an organization that was initially created to help delineate borders. Because these borders had been so remote and so fluid in many ways, it wasn't clear what they are. And so suddenly, when the Soviet Union fell apart, China finds itself not only sharing a border with Russia, which it had to sort of completely define, but suddenly 3 entirely new countries, Tajikistan, Kyrgyzstan, and Kazakhstan. And so the initial creation of this Shanghai Five entity, which was pushed by Jiang Zemin, was an entity to try to delineate borders, establish sort of new military relations and parameters in this space.
Who else was in the Shanghai Five?
So the Shanghai Five was made up of China, Russia, Kazakhstan, Kyrgyzstan, and Tajikistan. It was very much about what the border that China used to share with the Soviet Union. It suddenly became a border, in fact, that had these 4 different countries.
Fascinating. And so now, what are its main goals there then? Trade and resources? Would you say that's fair?
So I think the principal issue that animates Chinese thinking towards Central Asia is really one about domestic stability. And in many ways, this is true of every country. Every country's foreign policy is defined by its domestic policy interests, right? And I think when you're talking about Central Asia, you're really talking about Xinjiang from China's perspective. And from China's perspective, they've seen historically how Xinjiang has had this trouble between the Uyghur minority and the Han increasing majority, which has led to violence. And they've seen links to this violence across the borders because there are large Uyghur diasporas in these places and in the past dissidents have hidden there. And so we've had a sort of history of trouble. So there is that kind of security concern. But then I think in the longer term, in some ways, we can look at the Chinese security response to Xinjiang to try to stabilize the region and the very heavy security response. But the Chinese government, I think, recognizes that the long-term stability to Xinjiang is really going to come from economic prosperity. So from their perspective, for this region to be stable and to not have this tension between these minority communities and the majority, they need to have an economically prosperous region. But if you're going to make Xinjiang economically prosperous, you're going to have to find a way of connecting it to the world, because Xinjiang is in many ways is landlocked and disconnected from the seas and the traditional sea routes which generate so much of the world's trade than frankly any of the Central Asian countries it's next to. So in some ways, to sort of open up Xinjiang and make Xinjiang more connected up to the world and ultimately more prosperous, you really have to sort of open up routes across land. And this is where I think one of the key underlying interests lies with China's interest in Central Asia. It's really about trying to improve the kind of prosperity in this border region around Xinjiang to help improve Xinjiang's prosperity and also Xinjiang's stability. Looking beyond that, there are also, this is an area that is rich in natural resources, oil and gas, lots of minerals. And these are all things that, the Chinese, economic machine consumes and is looking for. And so, of course, having these ripe opportunities right in your border are, of course, interesting to Chinese companies.
So let's talk about Xinjiang first then. Fascinating what you're saying about the long-term strategy of making the region prosperous, because I think that's often not discussed because we are focusing quite a lot on the dire persecution of the Uyghur people happening in the region. But then the longer term is the thinking from Beijing: make them richer, make them more stable, make them more prosperous, and therefore they're not going to be rebelling against central authority in the way that they have been so far.
Yes, I think that's the ultimate vision. I mean, I think, the Chinese government recognizes that, a very strong security crackdown is not necessarily going to deal with these problems in perpetuity. You know what I mean? And so they recognize that to try to turn that corner eventually is going to require something else to have changed in the environment. And they think the key element is economic prosperity. And I think they would look around the country and say, look at the rest of the country. We had instability in other places and now we've got wild prosperity.
Although, you see the same kind of logic going for Hong Kong, right? I mean, during the 2019 protests, so many Chinese in the mainland were saying the problem is the house prices there. The young are dissatisfied because of the house prices and they're channeling it into political disillusionment. Seems to me it's quite a Marxist interpretation that economics underlies everything and also misses the point of the importance of identity, culture, religion. But before we get on to all of that, I just want to first touch on, that under-discussed part of the Xinjiang policy. What is China doing to try to make Xinjiang richer? So you've talked about trade cross-border into Central Asia, but is there more stuff happening internally in China as well?
Yes, there is. There's a great deal. And you can go back, and I think the interesting recent turning point in kind of China's policies towards Xinjiang, you can probably trace back to July 2009, when you had large-scale rioting in Urumqi, where reporting was around 200 people were killed in clashes between Uyghur and Han. It's possible more. We really don't know the sort of full details. But that kind of marked an interesting watershed moment, I think, in recent Chinese policy towards Xinjiang, because after that, you saw a real effort by the central government to rethink the approach that had been taken until then, because, that event took place when then Premier Hu Jintao was in Italy at a G7, G8, what was it at the time, G8 summit in L'Aquila, Italy. You know, it was being feted on the international stage. You know, this is China's rising moment, so on and so forth. And he had to leave all of that to go scuttling back home to try to resolve this domestic clash, right? And that was pretty embarrassing from Beijing's perspective. So after that moment, you see a real turnaround in the policy, and a long-standing leader who'd been in charge there, Wang Lechuan, who'd ruled the province for 15 years or so, was rather unceremoniously shunted on. And you see a real change. And one of the big changes that you saw was a real attempt to push more domestic economy towards Xinjiang. So you had a lot of twinning. So some of the richer coastal cities were given responsibility for prefectures in Xinjiang. You know, one example I remember was, I think, Shanghai was given responsibility for parts of Kashgar. And they were said, you know, cadres from the region were told you have to go work in Xinjiang, you know, to help the local cadres become more efficient and develop and try to copy Shanghai's success. I mean, lots of other cities, Tianjin, Beijing, others all had responsibility for different parts. So there was that kind of twinning that happened. Provinces were told to give some portion of their GDP to Xinjiang to, again, help improve the economy as sort of aid of a sort. And you saw companies from these various regions being encouraged to go out there. And I remember meeting in my sort of travels around Central Asia, you know, and actually in Xinjiang as well, you know, people from Guangzhou whose company had been told, go set up a factory in Xinjiang. So they'd go and set up a factory in Xinjiang to try to help, you know, the region. So there was a lot of kind of internal economics that happened to try to do all of this. And as well as the external facing part, which...
Right. How would you evaluate the success of that strategy? Because it does seem that often the economic growth that the region has seen comes at a cost to local culture, or through literally exploiting the Uyghur people as forced labour, or at the very least, the Uyghur people don't get a share of the growth pie because, as you mentioned, it's Han people from other parts of China coming in. Is that fair? Is that why they're not being co-opted into this, you know, very nice-sounding mission?
I think there's a certain element of that. You know, it's not clear how much the people who need to benefit from it are really benefiting from it. It's very difficult to sort of objectively ascertain that, but certainly anecdotally, it doesn't seem like it's always sort of happened. But I think, you know, you know, the fundamental question is what metric do you look at? You know, and I think from a Chinese government perspective, they would say you've got stability in Xinjiang now. And as we just saw with Xi Jinping visiting the region, he would say, well, it's now stable. We saw him not talking about terrorism during his last visit. And we saw him talking about, look at how, you know, economic. So I think from their perspective, they would look at this and say, yes, we have delivered that. Now, has it really dealt with the problem in the longer term? And has it dealt with all the issues? And you touched briefly on the question of, you know, this quite Marxist notion of it all being about the resources, you know, and if everyone just has the resources, they'll be happy and not, you know. Clearly, that's not what motivates people. You know, people get motivated by their ideas and sense of self and so on and so forth. And I don't think they've kind of addressed that in some way. So, you know, I think that it's questionable about whether this approach will actually deliver the goal that they want. But this is, the Chinese government thinks this is the approach to take. And I think then to just sort of on the Uyghur issue in particular, I think the other point that we always have to remember with this is in overall national Chinese terms, this is a marginal issue. You know, it's always worth remembering that, you know, the Uyghur people, which are, I think, about 10 million is the sort of estimate that people run around with. That's out of a population of 1.4 billion in China. So you're talking about a small community within the country that lives on the farthest fringes of it. Most Chinese haven't sort of ever really encountered this at all. So all they've really heard is what they've maybe seen in the state media, which is, frankly, a quite negative story. So, I mean, in overall national policy terms, this isn't necessarily the priority that some of us externally would look at it. And so I think that allows a level of kind of policy approach that Beijing can take, which to us outside we say, well, that's clearly not going to work, but actually it's probably delivering what they want, which is not generating violence and incidents within the country of instability, which is what they're kind of trying to avoid. Because I would agree, I don't think that, you know, people are always motivated, frankly, by money and lives. They're clearly not. There's lots of other motivations which drive people, and especially if you're living in an ethnically homogenous country like China and you have an identity that is very different.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let's talk about identity, because just one last question on the Xinjiang issue, which is that do the Central Asian governments and people see what's happening in Xinjiang, and are they concerned about it? Because there is much more religious and ethnic solidarity, one would think. But actually, I don't know, you don't really hear the Kazakhstan government really protesting against what's happening in Xinjiang. Can you talk a little bit about that?
So, I mean, in my experience of traveling around the region, I must say I found a limited pool of solidarity towards the Uyghur people suffering in Central Asia. I don't want to say everyone was heartless. Everyone recognized, you know, that there was something happening there. But there was a sense, well, these people are Chinese, right? They live in
Right,
China.
so they don't think that they're this idea of East Turkestan, which some Uyghurs talk about.
They do, but it's not. We have it's kind of a bit of it's maybe a simplistic view that we have of this region. We say, well, they're all Turkic peoples except for the Tajiks, so therefore they must all get along,
Sure.
and they must all, be friendly with Turkey and everything else. Well, that's not always true. I remember one of my funny encounter in one of the Central Asian countries. I went to the Turkish embassy, who were very kind and sort of took time out to talk to me. And I said, well, how much does this Turkic, solidarity and thing work? And they said, well, it's interesting. We try to support it. And there are lots of, Turkish schools and so on that advance around the region. But they said that one of the biggest problems they encountered was they would find Turkish businessmen who would come out to the region and just say, oh, I can talk, language to these people. And so they would just try to go do a business deal.
Yeah.
And they discover, actually, no, the languages they are close, but they're not identical. When you get into a business negotiation, you've got to be precise, you've got to be right. And so the embassy would find itself suddenly getting called by this Turkish businessman saying, could you send me a translator? Because, I'm trying to conclude a deal.
How did you find, because you did so much field work for this book over a course of over a decade, how did you guys find traveling around given that language problem? Because I think you both are fluent Mandarin speakers. Is that right?
So I speak Mandarin.
Yeah.
It's gone a bit rustier over time, but I function in Mandarin. And at various moments I traveled with other friends and colleagues who spoke a bit of Russian. Okay. And then we found local fixers who would kind of help us out whenever we needed to.
Okay. And there was a Chinese and Russian, how good was that in getting around?
We were looking for Chinese people and Chinese speakers.
Sure.
So it was useful to that regard, but it's certainly true that it wasn't always, it was useful to have others helping around with languages as well. What I would say in the region is interesting is, they, as time has gone on, I have found more Mandarin speakers in the region.
Sure.
And in Tajikistan is the most live example of that. When I first went, I struggled. We really struggled to find anyone who really cared. There was a few Chinese businessmen there, but it was very limited. Now, there's lots of Tajiks, young Tajiks who've learned Mandarin and sort of want to know more. And the interesting thing on the Russian side is actually what we discovered is the more you get outside the big cities, actually Russian is starting to fade away in some ways, and the local languages are taking over. And this is actually something that the governments are not always that happy about. On the one hand, they're pleased their national language is sort of being advanced, but they recognize that, if you want to get ahead in the world, speaking Russian, if you're from this part of the world, it's not unhelpful. It does open up a world of opportunities to you that, maybe just speaking Uzbek does not, so it's an interesting kind of balance that you see there.
And you get some of that desire to have a global language under your belt through people who want to learn Mandarin as well in these places. Talk a little bit about the Confucius Institutes and their role in that then.
So I was very fortunate. I mean, one of the things I have to say in doing this work over and travel around the region was, I found Chinese traders and teachers I would find always very welcoming and always very friendly. They're always quite curious to have a sort of white person coming up to them in the middle of Central Asia to talk Chinese to them. They're like, what's this about?
Are they surprised?
They were tended to be surprised and sort of intrigued and curious, and then they'd sort of take some time, say, let's go and get something to eat, which was very nice. But the Confucius Institutes were always very welcoming, frankly. They were always willing to kind of, engage and talk to us. And it was an interesting mix of people that we met there. It was there was an element of some of them were, clearly people who'd been sent out there. So they were there for, 2 years or whatever it was. And they were
Chinese people.
Chinese teachers who Hanban had sent out to go and, educate the masses kind of thing. And, they were kind of there punching a clock and they would sort of complain about the locals and so on and so forth. And then you had some who really embraced it. There was one particular teacher who I saw over a number of years who kind of stayed on and clearly he was very happy there, and the local students really liked him as well, and he was very much a teacher, and he saw himself in that light. And it was interesting because whenever we were always trying to understand what were the institutes doing, and how much was there's a lot of concern sometimes about narratives that they're pushing and the culture that they're trying to sort of warp, and they were always very clear that we're here to teach these people Mandarin.
Okay.
And they would say, oh no, we don't do any cultural things, and actually they did tend to do cultural things as well. But it seemed like quite a transactional, frankly, relationship, and it was all about trying to get these students
to learn Mandarin.
And
then they in turn, you mentioned at one point in your book, they in turn were learning Mandarin, often not because of some kind of romantic ideal about the Chinese language, but because of the real benefits it could give them in their careers.
Yeah, I mean, one of the big things you noticed was, when you'd ask the kids, 你为什么说中文? They would say, oh, 爸爸说, it was usually their parents had frankly told them, I need you to learn Mandarin because, I need you to be able to go talk to the guy in Guangzhou who we want to do business with, and I want you, So it was a very kind of transactional relationship. We found very few who, were like, I study this because I want to read, Sun Tzu in the original language or something, There was one very charming young woman we met in Uzbekistan who was a very fluent Mandarin speaker, and was correcting me all the time, and my Mandarin works, but I recognize it's not great. But she was like, "Oh, your Mandarin's awful," and she kept correcting me. But she, her goal was to be a presenter on CCTV. She thought this would be a really cool and wonderful thing to do. And
have you caught up with her? Has she made it?
I haven't seen her on TV yet, to be honest with you. But I must say, I don't watch CCTV or CGTN a huge amount, so it's possible she's doing someone. But she was very ambitious and very keen to do it, and but she was a rarity, I must say. It was.
So Confucius Institutes are quite a live topic at the moment in the UK, in particular because Rishi Sunak, as we record, he is still in the race for Tory leader, has said that he'll ban them. Liz Truss has pretty much signalled similar things. Legislators in the British government have said that they want to basically put more restrictions on them such that alternatives perhaps from Taiwan will come. Concerns are basically that they spy on their students, that they promote some kind of CCP narrative. Did you see signs of, I don't know, I guess political infiltration in the target Central Asian countries that these Confucius Institutes operated in when you were travelling around?
I mean, I did see things that I wondered a bit about, but not within the Confucius Institutes, to be honest with you. Within the Confucius Institutes themselves, I found, what looked like what they were trying to be, which was didactic institutions, and I must say the most interesting thing to me was to look at the different countries and to see, because we talk about Central Asia, we've been talking about it as though it's one homogenous region. It's not, of course. These are 5 very different countries in many ways, but if you were to put them in brackets, let's say, you could look at Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan and say these are very aid-dependent countries. And you could look at Kazakhstan and say it's a very wealthy country. Uzbekistan, which is, a big trading nation and has a large population. And then Turkmenistan, which is a very difficult country in many ways, but one where it's quite difficult to get a grip on exactly where sort of wealth or poverty sits. It's a rich country, but there's lots of dissonances within. But so within that bracket, the Confucius Institutes fit. In the sense that in the aid-dependent ones, these are countries that they want help from everybody. So if someone's going to come and offer them a free course, to learn a language which will help them advance in some way, great. They need it. You know what I mean? There just isn't other stuff there. So there's like a benefit. And so, you could see that there it's really a question of do they want to go to the Confucius Institute or do they want to go whatever American institute is based or, the British Council if it's there. And frankly, they'd like all of them to be around because they can see an opportunity there for all of them. So the institutions end up feeding that need, and the need is a very kind of pragmatic one. I think when you look at a place like Kazakhstan or Uzbekistan, which has got some very good universities with long histories of teaching languages and other things, it's a very different kind of relationship. And so the Confucius Institutes in some ways become poor siblings to the local universities,
really? Okay.
where actually the local universities is where the real Mandarin teaching is happening. And actually you see some Hanban teachers being sent there, but it's a very pragmatic kind of relationship. And I think some of the political influence and interference questions that we worry about here and control on the discourses in the university campus, it's a very different conversation in the Central Asian countries about what discourses are permitted in those sorts of environments anyway.
Yeah.
So
because
it's a very different clash that you're talking about.
Are they almost all one-party systems anyway, politically speaking?
No, I mean, Kyrgyzstan has elections.
Okay.
The elections, unfortunately, usually result in violence. But in a lot of the other countries, you have, governments that have a pretty, smooth transition from one to another.
Okay.
But, it's not a democratic polity in the way that we might look at it here, where, it's an open election which, has multiple candidates.
I just wondered if there was like a strongman affinity between China and its dealings with some of these countries.
Yes, I think there is certainly some of that. There is certainly some of that.
Which might also be relevant for what we were talking about just now with the Uyghur treatment.
I think there's an element of that. I think there it's more a question of where they do worry about Xinjiang. They do worry about it more in terms of when there are co-ethnics getting involved.
Of course.
So the Kazakh government has lobbied the Chinese government for better treatment of Kazakhs who were caught up in the systems in China. Mm-hmm. And there seems to be some evidence that it might have worked, actually. Okay. I think the Kyrgyz have tried to do the same thing to Tajiks as well. And they've had some protests in their countries that are expressing solidarity for that. But what you don't see is a wholesale sense of condemnation of China and what it's doing, in the same way. In part because, yes, they're all countries that kind of have one party structure and, can kind of want to support each other and don't want to undermine each other and, don't throw stones in glass houses, right? So, there's an element of that plays into it as well. And a sense that, frankly, the Chinese don't criticize what we do within our borders. And so we're not going to criticize what they're going to do in theirs.
Sure. I want to also talk about trade. Raf, I wonder if you can give an overview of the economic interests that China has with these 5 countries, maybe just in terms of sectors, because there's energy, isn't there? But there's also resources and minerals. So maybe just give a brief overview of what the main picture looks like.
So, the trading picture is quite substantial and quite important for all of these countries. It's grown a lot over time. Energy is a key component of it. Of course, China has investments in hydrocarbons fields in Kazakhstan, in Turkmenistan to a great degree, in Uzbekistan and Tajikistan a bit. In Kyrgyzstan, there's just not that much there. So, energy is a big component of it. But I think the key thing I would say is energy in all sorts of ways. So, for example, China's a big consumer of uranium from Kazakhstan. China's also quite involved in the renewables sector in these countries, both in terms of helping them refurbish old infrastructure that they have, but also build new ones. And they're even suppliers of petrol. There's Chinese companies doing, supplying gas at the pumps in these countries. So the energy relationship is much more complicated than just saying they're buying, or they're companies that they're digging up oil. And I think that's the key point that I always try to find was that it was, we have a tendency to think about the relationship with China being quite binary or quite simple in a sort of one track. But actually, it's just incredibly wide ranging. So when we talk about trade, if you go to any market in Central Asia, it's full of Chinese goods, and that's Chinese goods of every sort you can imagine. And actually, increasingly interesting, you can see if you go to like Taobao or some of these Chinese platforms, you can see that actually Central Asian companies are setting up platforms on these to try to sell their goods into the Chinese market. So, and that's a lot of agriculture, frankly, products and, quite simple things like that they produce. So it's a very kind of wide ranging relationship, that goes into all sorts of directions. And it's really a case of you've got these countries that have natural resources that goes beyond hydrocarbons. There's minerals, there's copper, there's zinc, iron, all sorts of other things that the kind of Chinese market wants. As well as products, by products, I mean everything from, white goods to pens to, well, frankly, all of us get all of our goods from China these days, right? So, that's true, of course, in a country that's neighboring it. But then, the other side of this is of course, trade investment in terms of, infrastructure construction. There's a lot of that that's happening as well. And, it's always interesting to observe that this is the place where the Belt and Road Initiative was first announced and was sort of christened. And I think that's very much because the Belt and Road in itself is basically Xi Jinping putting a name on what had been happening in Central Asia for some time already, and then taking that model and globalizing it. So I think this is why I think the relationship that China has with Central Asia is a very large, wide-ranging and complicated economic one that goes far beyond the simple narrative which you often hear, which is these are countries with lots of natural resources. China wants its natural resources. That's a component of it. Yeah. But it's actually a much more wide-ranging economic relationship.
Well, I thought one interesting part one of the many interesting parts in your book was about sometimes this difference in the Chinese relationship with these countries compared to the Russian relationship before. For example, you give this example of oil refineries and how Russian companies like Gazprom would split up regions within the countries, whereas China was doing it in a slightly different way. Could you explain that and what you identified as the difference between those relationships were?
So I think if I put it in really simple terms, I've always thought the relationship that you had between Russia and the region and China and the region was in some ways Russia doesn't really see this as an independent region. It kind of sees it as an extension of itself, and so it treats it in a very paternalistic way. And you could see its companies operating in a similar environment. They say, well, these are just these poor Central Asians. Of course, we're going to do business there and we'll tell them what to do and we'll kind of control this in the way that we want to control it. Whereas the Chinese approach is far more transactional. It was, we're coming to you, country X, in this case, Kyrgyzstan, what is the need here? We'll offer you a project. We'll offer you loans to do that. We'll send our companies to deliver the project. You'll agree to these terms, we'll sign an agreement, and then we'll do it. And it's just very transactional, very focused on that specific need and interest. And the wider part of it doesn't really matter. The wider part of it, well, that's someone else's problem to worry about. Whereas Russia takes a much more kind of, as I say, paternalistic view of this region. And that extends in all sorts of economic ways as well. We can see Russian companies treated as their kind of, natural backyard, if you will. And even if you look at the sort of constructs that have been created in some ways, the economic constructs to link this region up, to Russia and to China specifically. Russia had, so back when the Soviet Union was falling apart, the then leader of Kazakhstan, Nazarbayev, suggested the idea of creating what he called a Eurasian Economic Union. And it was an attempt to basically try to keep the economic, sinews that kept the Soviet Union together going, because Central Asian countries recognized that they were suddenly getting pushed out into the cold, and they really didn't know how to manage their own kind of national economy this way. And they were very tied to Russia, and it was very important that way. And so he suggested this idea, but it never went anywhere because Moscow had other preoccupations. It wasn't really interested in having to bail out these countries. Now, I think it was around 2005, you see the Russians start to reawaken this conversation, and you see them pushing this idea forwards. And now they very much realized it. And essentially the creation of the Eurasian Economic Union, which in Central Asia encompasses Kazakhstan and Kyrgyzstan, essentially gives Moscow control over these countries' tariffs, external facing tariffs.
Okay,
and
wow.
It has a very strong kind of relationship.
Like a customs union.
Customs union. Exactly what it is. It's a customs union. And it's very favorable in some ways. And a lot of the people I've spoken to in these countries have said, look, when we signed up to join this Eurasian Economic Union, we thought there was going to be kind of a benefit for our companies as well. But they said, actually, it really turned out it was the Russian companies that really benefited from this.
Right.
So it's very much a relationship that's stacked in that way. Now, the Chinese approach, I'm not going to say it was much more magnanimous in some ways, but it was much more transactional. So if you look at the visions that China's offered in economic terms, there's the Shanghai Cooperation Organization that evolves from the Shanghai Five that we briefly talked about before, where China's long talked about creating free trade area within that. It's never actually taken off because not all the partners want it. But that was really about trying to improve trade between all of this area, right? And doubtless Chinese companies would have been able to benefit, but the idea would have been others would have as well. And if we look at the Belt and Road Initiative, it's really about offering projects to these places and sort of doing those transactions. And that, as I say, the Russian approach does tend to be a little bit different.
That's really interesting. What do these countries then think about the fact that they now have a new, big boss in the area that is not the USSR or Russia anymore, but it's China? How do they feel about that? I guess we can say, what is the political interest in China, and also does public opinion differ? Is there more xenophobia in public opinion?
Yes, there is. In short, there is a great deal of. One of the things we always found sadly consistently was a very basic kind of racism, towards Chinese in the region. They're very, horrible yellow peril kind of narratives. There was that, you would find that quite frequently at a public level. And
it's interesting the conspiracy theories that you list, people talking to you in hushed tones about, how these Chinese roads are built so that they can hold the weight of a Chinese tank.
Right.
It's quite funny stuff, but you can definitely see how that takes root and is actually quite terrifying.
No, there is a real edge there, and it's quite dark in some ways. And, you do have instances of clashes between communities that happen quite a lot. Well, not quite a lot, that's an exaggeration, but they do happen. It's not infrequent. And, it is a very kind of, basic racism. But what's interesting is that sometimes, this problem actually escalates to the point where it causes problems at a national level. Because the governments, of course, have a very different view of China.
Yes.
Because for them, this is a big economic opportunity, the Central Asian countries recognize that, they're sitting next to the world's second largest economy now. And, this is clearly the big growth story of our time. And that's what they want to connect with. So they can see that opportunities there and they want to advance it. And you find often that, it gets, you have public protests happen to the point where they have to sort of hide projects or walk back from deals that were being struck because it was causing so much tensions.
Well, you also describe how some Chinese companies basically hide their presence in cities. It's very hard to see there's anything Chinese about this business site at all. Is that? Yeah, no,
there are some cities in Kazakhstan, particularly in the sort of oil regions, where you would go there, and we know CNPC is a very big player, but you just couldn't find evidence of them, and you'd sort of ask the locals, where are the CNPC guys? And they're like, we don't know what you're talking about. We tried to find a Chinese restaurant and, they sent us to a Korean one instead, so they were like, there's no sense of, that they're really hidden away. And, we did finally find some of the Chinese engineers and they said, we live, outside the city at an old Soviet sanatorium where we're all kept. But I know also that when these companies have people going into Kazakhstan in particular, but also in some of the other countries, they're briefed about, what they should do. And they're told, always travel around in groups, make sure if a local officer shows up, here's what you should do, give him...
Well, yeah, because it's not just the locals that have a preconceived image of what the Chinese are like, because what we're seeing when the Chinese go to places like Africa is that they have a stereotype of the locals there as well, being, uneducated or fundamentally lazy. Is that the same for Central Asia as well?
Very, very strong sentiment of that. I mean, you had a lot of think of a lot of instances where, it's like, well, these people are just lazy, they don't work as hard. And this plays in an interesting way in the kind of the state-state relationships, because in a lot of cases, one of the issues we found sometimes is, people say Chinese companies, when they come, they always bring their own workers, and this, is something that, is negative because you're depriving the locals of jobs. And what you sometimes find with the company would say, well, we want to deliver this project in 6 months. And the government would say, we want that project in 6 months, because there's some local election cycle they want to hit. The leader wants to show, I brought you this, wonderful new road or whatever, and they would say, well, look, if you want us to do that, we got to bring in Chinese workers, And so the government would say, yeah, well, the local rules say you must hire this many locals. And I'm like, fine, we can do that, but it's going to take 9 months, And so what tends to happen is the government would say, yeah, let's just make it happen, okay? And so they would sort of sweep it through. But yeah, those kind of narratives of kind of indolent locals who are not up to the standard of Chinese workers. And actually it plays the other way, which is that, the locals will look at the Chinese workers and say, these people work like dogs and they're prisoners, you know what I mean? They're actual, former convicts of China who've been sent into the region to do these horrible jobs, because they couldn't conceive why these people would work 24/7 for, a long period of time and live in pretty grotty conditions and seemingly be okay with that. And, the truth is there are some pretty diligent Chinese workers out there who are willing to tolerate these because of the paycheck at the end, which they will happily send home. So, it's but the interpretation of that in a local context is very interesting.
Yeah, and Raf, we're quickly running out of time, and we haven't even talked about Afghanistan at all. Although for listeners who do want to know more about Afghanistan, I have done another episode about that, which we can link in the description. But just one question, which is kind of related to Afghanistan. The subtitle of your book is An Inadvertent Empire. What do you mean by that?
So the notion inadvertent empire is that you've got this part of the world where China is becoming the most consequential player on the ground, but we find very little evidence of Beijing having a plan about what to do, and very little evidence of any thinking about, well, what then does it mean if you become the most consequential player on the ground, in the sense that, these countries will look to you for problems. These are countries, unfortunately, that have problems within them. If we just look at the past year, you've had major instability in Kazakhstan, Uzbekistan, which was a shock to everyone, by the way, in those two countries. In Tajikistan, you've still got a lot of violence happening there, and you've got border clashes between Kyrgyzstan and Tajikistan, and you've had the Taliban takeover in Afghanistan. So this is a region that is volatile, shall we say. And increasingly, you've got there as the big player a power that has very little interest in trying to resolve any of these issues, that will look at this in a very kind of transactional way.
Was there more political leadership from the USSR and from the US as well when they take leadership in parts of the world? Is that the kind of leadership of a great power, the responsibilities of a great power that China hasn't quite stepped up into?
Yes. I think that's a very accurate way of putting it, frankly. The other powers that have sort of had this dominant role in the region have taken a very different view to what they're doing there. I mean, the United States, 20-year experiment in Afghanistan was, a state building one, right? Did it work? Well, but that was the effort there, to try to reconstruct this country in this way. And you can still see the US has strong relationships with a lot of the other neighboring countries, a lot of conflicts with some of them as well, if you think about Iran. But, that's kind of the vision that they always had, whereas China just does not have this approach at all. It's much more, again, transactional, very focused on what is the deal we're trying to do here and now. But the point is that those deals are huge, and they have game-changing impact within those countries. In Afghanistan, for all of the American effort and investment that you saw over 20 years there, the biggest investment projects into the country were Chinese. Now, contracts were signed, not maybe as much happened as should have been expected, frankly, and in the project in Messainak, the copper mine there, that was signed in 2007, nothing's happened since. So there's a question, but it was Chinese companies that were doing those big investments. And actually the Afghan government at the time was very eager to encourage more of that. And actually the new Taliban government is as well, because they all see that China is kind of the big economic player in their backyard and the one they want to connect with. So it's an interesting dynamic that you've got this region which has increasingly come under kind of Chinese thrall, and where China is such a consequential player. But the approach that China is going to take and the vision that China has is just so different to, frankly, the approaches that you saw before. And it's not going to try to resolve any of these problems. It's just going to let them play out and see what happens and deal with whoever comes out on top.
And very finally then, Raf, we hear a lot about this Indo-Pacific tilt, but Central Asia is not in the Indo-Pacific. There's a lot of attention on China in Africa, China in South America, but nobody ever talks about China in Central Asia except for you and I right now. So do you think that the West is overlooking this part, the political, geopolitical tensions and ramifications here?
Look, I think that this is one of the huge lacuna, frankly, in Western strategic thinking. And it's one of my endless frustrations that we have this sort of constant obsession with the maritime, China and what it's doing there. And there is zero discussion of the fact that China is becoming the most consequential player on the Eurasian heartland. Now, what does that actually mean and what does it matter? It's a good question. Now, if we go back and look at history and we think about, the great geographer Halford Mackinder, he identified this region as, the geopolitical pivot of the world. And he who controlled this would control the Eurasian island, and controlling the Eurasian island means you control the world, right? That's in very sort of grandiloquent terms. But I think more seriously, if we think about recent times, some pretty major problems have emanated from this region. And instability in this region has a direct contiguous link to Europe, for a start. So there is a kind of direct connection there that I just see no real serious strategic thinking about. It's this fixation with the maritime relationships and what we see happening there, which I think misses the fact that there is this giant change happening in the Eurasian heartland where there's no sort of engagement. Now, having said that there's no engagement, I think that there is some thinking about happening in Washington, but it's definitely not the priority. There are definitely many other priorities, and I can kind of understand why. But I think in European thinking, it's a real missing piece, where I think a lot of European strategists are so obsessed with sort of focusing on following the sort of American push to the seas that they're kind of missing the fact that the contiguous territory that they have with China is, the space from China is shrinking. This area is becoming increasingly Chinese influence, and that is, something they're not even trying to deal with. People often compare, and they say, a question I've been asked a lot sort of over the years as well, look at what the Chinese do in Africa, and how those relationships play out. Surely that's just what's going to happen in Central Asia. And I think that misses the point, because to go back right to where we started, this for China is about domestic stability and security in Xinjiang. So it's a very different kind of relationship that they're going to sort of continue to manage going forwards. And the kind of interest that they're going to focus on there and what they're going to do and how they're going to advance it is linked to their direct domestic security. Not, in Africa, quite frankly, if a project goes wrong, shut up shop, move on to the next one. Yeah. Let's just not do that again. You know what I mean? You can't do that in Central Asia because you're the neighbor. And so you're just going back home and you're creating problems which are going to come and blow right back at you. So it's a very, very, very different relationship. And I think it's one that really there should be a lot more thinking about the consequences of it. Look, we've just been fighting a war in Afghanistan for 20 years. Afghanistan is the region that we're talking about here. So, problems from this region do have a habit of reaching out and hitting us. So having a better sense of how we're managing equities and how the future and how stability is going to play out there is, I think, quite important.
Well, if you're a policymaker and you're listening to this podcast, I've got a book to plug you. Actually, Raf, you can plug your own book. What's the full name? The
book is called Sinostan, China's Inadvertent Empire.
Well, there we go.
Buy a copy, buy your family copy, send one to your friends, everyone. Christmas must be coming soon,
Exactly. Raffaello Pantucci, thank you so much for doing Chinese Whispers.
Thank you so much for the invitation.